Hello everybody, this is International Master Asaf Givon here today with you once again, and today we're going to examine the topic of pawn breaks in the middle game. So I'm going to present 3 examples of some practical chess games, some of them of very strong players, some of them of amateur players. So this would be the first position for today. In this position, it's a very theoretical position. It's coming from the Catalan opening, and black plays here the move knight to d7, and now it's white to move, and I invite you to think, how would you play here with white? What would be your move? So actually, in the actual game that we see, white played a very innocent looking move, and a move which I think many of us or many players would play like almost without too much thinking. They would say, okay, black developed a piece to d7, I should also develop a piece, so knight to c3. But now after this move, black has a very strong answer, because in the initial position we see that the position is rather normal position after the opening. We can see that black is quite actively positioned with his pieces. He has a nice bishop on the diagonal, good piece development, but he only has one problem, and it's this backward pawn on c7, which in the future might become a target to attack by the white's pieces, because it's also situated against an open file. So later on white could use moves like rook to c1 in order to put more pressure against this pawn. Also, white has the advantage of having a pawn in the center of the board, the one on d4, while black does not having that much control over the center like white. So this is why after knight to c3, black is extremely happy to play the pawn break, pawn to c5 here, practically forcing the exchange of pawns. And now we see a completely different scenario in which white, first of all, his important central pawn has disappeared. Now he has no more control over the center than black. Now black got rid of his backward pawn on c7, so now from structural point of view black has no problems. He even have the slightly more active pawn structure on the queen side with those pawns on a6 and b5, and also he is ready now to play the move rook to c8, trying to use the open file which was opened in the last moves by the move c5. So going back to the initial position, in this position white's only move to fight for the against the pawn break on c5, which is a very strong move, which is also quite typical for this specific opening, is bishop to a5, obviously threatening the pawn on c7 with the bishop. But the real point of this move is just to fight against the pawn break with c5, because as long as black is kept been kind of stopped from playing the move c5, he is not going to be able to get rid of this weakness. And after a move like rook to c8, trying to protect the pawn, white can develop a piece with with knight from b to d2. Now let's suppose black is playing the move queen to e8. So how would you react now with white? So as you are probably understand by now, black having a positional threat right now. He wants to play the pawn break, pawn to c5, once again relieving himself from the backward pawn on c7, opening up the rook on c8. So how could white prevent this? b4, very important move. Once again, keeping this pawn on c7 caged and not able to move to c5. And later on in the game, white will try to put pressure on this pawn on c7 with his rook and his bishop. And while black's position is still quite solid, once he did not get this pawn break in the center with c5, his position is much more cramped and white is having the more pleasant position. So here we saw a case in which the pawn break is serving the purpose of getting rid of a backward pawn, a weak pawn. Let's see some other example. So not this one. So this is the second example. It's black to move, and once again, my mistake. It's white played here knight to f2, and here it's black to move. So now I would ask you to find a move for black or a plan. How would you proceed here with the black pieces? So as you can notice, the position is rather closed by its nature. There is very little contention between pawns. The pawns on the E and the F file are blocked. The center is blocked, so the position is rather close. So in this position, both players, in order to open up the game and to have more get more power to their pieces, they have to search for pawn breaks in order to open up the position. So black has basically a couple of potential pawn breaks in the position. So we can try to break on the king side with a move like g5. We can try to break on the queen side with the march of the pawn to a4, trying to open up the a file, maybe create a weakness on the b3 square. And okay, one might think about pushing the d pawn, but this would be very difficult because white has a lot of control over the d3 square and is very likely to put his knight on d3 on the next move and completely block the pawn on d4. So basically, how should black, let's say, approach to this position? It's first of all by thinking by the main principle, and this is like a general tip, not only for this position but in chess in general. Try to play on the side on which your bishops aim at. And if we look at this position, we see this beautiful bishop on b7 is aiming at the king side, at the king on g1. So it actually helps us to understand that the pawn break on g5 is much more dangerous for white. So basically we want to open up the g file against the white king, and with the help from the bishop on b7 together with the rook or rooks on the g file, we could have a very strong pressure against white position. Of course, one might argue that the move g5 slightly weakens the black king on g8, and while this is true, we could see that the white's pieces are quite passively placed, especially this bishop on b2, which is a very bad piece right now, blocked by many pawns. And the position also rather closed, so it's really hard to imagine white having a huge attack in this position. And a very good illustration of black's power in this position would be if white takes on g5. So now, first of all, of course, we take the bishop on g5. So first of all, now the bishop has got a very nice square on this long diagonal, but this is only a temporary station for him, because on the next move he would very much like to land on this juicy e3 square. And if white plays naively in this position, a move like knight to d3, bishop e3 check, king h1, so we see that the king has now been forced to step into the bishop's diagonal on b7. And here, thanks to the fact that the g file was opened, black could easily build the pressure against this pawn on g2. So king h8, for example, followed by rook to g8, and black can even think about triple all of his heavy pieces on the g file. So rook to g6, then rook to g8, perhaps also the queen on g7. Every one of black's pieces would be ganged up against this pawn on g2, and eventually white would just be helpless because he has just not enough pieces to defend this pawn. So this is of course a bit of a cooperative variation, but it shows the potential of the black pieces when they kind of get to the game all together thanks to the pawn break on the king side. So white played a bit more cautiously with knight to d3. So now if black takes on f4, at least white can claim that he has now a nice square for his knight on f4, which aims at the pawn on e6 and for the moment is blocking the f pawn. But as we already know, black's main plan in this position is to get his rook into the g file, and there are more than one way to do so, but black chose to play the solid rook to f7, planning to play rook g7 on the next move. And once again, after the rook would step on g7, there would be a very strong pressure on the pawn on g2 from the g file and from the bishop on b7, which is once again perhaps black's most powerful piece in this position, and thanks to him all of those attacks are possible. So later on black won the game after a very nice position. I will drop the game on the PGN file in the link so you could see the game. And now let's see for dessert, perhaps the mother of all pawn breaks, really. So if in the previous example we saw a case of a very close type position in which the black player was seeking to open up the game for his pieces with the pawn break, here we can see a different scenario. The position is on the contrary quite opened. There is a lot of space for the pieces, but we can see that black's position is a bit cramped. He has this pawn formation which is called the hedgehog system, in which black places almost all of his pawns on the 6th rank, but he's kind of hoping to break through in the right moment in the center. So this is a very classical game from Lev Polgaevsky against Lubomir Vtachnik with the black pieces, a game from Chess Olympiad of 1982. And black is fully developed in this position. We also see that white's king is slightly exposed with his pawn on f4 and g3. So black found here really a perfect moment to break in the center with d5. Excellent move. Now after this pawn break we see that now the bishop is coming to life. But not only this, now after c takes d5, this is another method of pawn break, is trying to destroy the opponent's pawn structure or his king structure position. So now after the initial pawn break we see another pawn break, h4. So it's a rare case of a double pawn break, and the idea of those pawn breaks is just to completely shatter white's pawn structure on the king side. Now white cannot maintain his pawn on f4, so he was obliged to play knight takes h4. After knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, queen takes f4. We see that although technically black sacrificed one pawn, this pawn on h3 and h4 are really ugly, and Obviously white is not going to be too happy with his extra pawn. We see now that the queen got into a commanding position on f4, a very aggressive outpost, and all of black's pieces suddenly came into life. Now the d file was open for the rook, the c5 square is now available for the black bishop on e7, and from this position white's task of holding up his position together is quite difficult. So white took on e6, f takes e6, and we just see a position in which white's king is so exposed it's quite difficult here to even find the right moves here for white. But even if white finds his most accurate move, still I believe black has a overwhelming position by this point. Now white played the move e5, so threatening the knight on f6, but this move had a big drawback. Now it's opened up this diagonal for the bishop on b7, and after checking on c5, king h1 is forced. We see that black's position is completely battle worthy and battle ready, and by this point is really kind of begging, this position is begging for some tactics by black, and I really invite you to try to find the best move here for black, or the best continuation, which is both very beautiful and also very aesthetic. So black played here the move knight to h5, simply threatening knight to g3 with devastating effect. So white was forced to take this knight, and here comes the really important move of this variation, the quiet move queen to g3. And amazingly, it's quite difficult for white to defend from this simple threat of queen takes h3 checkmate, or queen takes g2 checkmate. So in his last attempt, by the way, if bishop takes bishop, this move is still a checkmate thanks to the bishop controlling the g1 square. So after knight to d5, this was white's last chance to block the long diagonal for the bishop. But black continued to play very, very well here. He took the knight with the rook. Very beautiful move. So his idea is to keep this diagonal open. And now the threat is, amongst others, to take the rook on d1 and then checkmating on the g2 square. So white tried to play rook f1, trying to avoid this exchange. But now this is really time to finish off white. So once again, I invite you to try to find yourself the strongest continuation here for black, and that one is queen takes bishop, king takes queen, rook d2 check, and you see this monstrous bishops together with the rook on d2 just crushing through white's position. White actually resigned by this point, but this is quite understandable, because if, for example, white plays king to g3, black has really more than one way to win here, but the most straightforward is rook g2 check, king f4, and now the simple rook f8 check, and white simply has no moves under the queen f7 check. And after rook takes f7, this is already checkmate. So this is one illustration amongst many of the power of pawn break in the middle of the game. In this position, this example, we see that black tried to achieve basically shattering white's pawn structure and his king position of the opponent. For me, this is perhaps the most beautiful and the most kind of typical example of a successful pawn break. So I really hoped you enjoyed the examples shown in this video, and thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye bye.